Thank you very much, Dr Levitt. I'll ask a couple of initial questions and then I'll offer the call to other members of the committee. I first want to return to this factual question that you addressed in the first part of your statement about whether any meaningful distinction can be drawn between the external security organisation and other parts of Hizballah, including the military ring as well as the whole organisation. I think your view is clear that that's not a meaningful distinction, but in your research, is there anyone who articulates a respectable case as to why they are different? Is there any plausible intellectual argument that makes that clear?
In a word, no. And the reason is that Hezbollah leaders themselves are extremely vocal, even angry about the idea that there could be different, distinct wings. Naim Qassem, the Deputy Secretary General of the organization, wrote a book in Arabic and in English about this. They basically make fun of people who suggest that there are actual distinctions. He's very clear. All of the aspects, all of the activities that Hezbollah engages in are done for a collective group of purposes, which include these militaristic and terrorist purposes. There's no question Hezbollah has multiple and sometimes competing goals. By virtue of putting so much effort into the war in Syria, Hezbollah is not doing as much targeting Israel right now. In order for me to be here right now, I had to decide to postpone my dinner. We all make decisions like that and prioritize things, but Hezbollah is committed to these multiple things in a single unitary way. The argument that people make is, yes, it's a unitary organization, but from a policy perspective, is it still wise to designate it as such? That's a conversation that reasonable people can have. There is not a reasonable argument to be made that, in fact, there are distinct wings within the group.
And in your view, what are the most important negative consequences of failing to designate the whole organisation?
Hezbollah continues to engage in the type of activities it engages in around the world, to include recruiting operatives from Western nations, including Australia, because it understands that there's little to no consequence for doing so. It engages the type of destabilizing activities in Lebanon that it engages in because it understands that there are limited to no consequences for doing so. And what I think the international community needs to do is to start showing that there are limited consequences for these types of behavior. I think also it's very important to understand that from a strictly law enforcement perspective, and I started my career in the FBI in counterterrorism, so I know from whence I speak. Hezbollah is engaged in extremely diverse and sophisticated money laundering and other illicit financial schemes, many of which touch Australia. And it is extremely difficult to investigate, let alone prosecute those when only part of the group is designated, because Hezbollah doesn't do us the courtesy of making clear that this money is going for the ESO and this money is going for something else. Monies are fungible, so they use that on purpose. They'll raise money for one thing and divert it for something else. So there are very tangible reasons for designating the entirety of the group.
Yes, and there is a relevant case in Australia, which we will no doubt come to with other witnesses. Just finally, Australia does take a different approach to this issue of most of our other like-minded countries. Our allies in the Five Eyes typically designate at least the military wing, if not the whole organisation. It has been occasionally suggested that perhaps there's some value in Australia taking a different position, that we might have better access or diplomacy might be more open. What value do you put in arguments like that?
Yeah, I challenge that because every country that has designated Hezbollah to include not just the terrorist wing, the ESO, but also the military and often the entire organization are able to have significant contact and influence within Lebanon, even to include with elements of Hezbollah itself. There is no reason why a designation should preclude those types of contacts. It's simply apples and oranges. The U.S. has designated Hezbollah in full for many, many years. We have a robust policy on Lebanon. We've been able to communicate things to Hezbollah as necessary. We've been able to have relationship with every part of the Lebanese government. The German government engages in back channel diplomacy, prisoner swaps, etc. I just don't see any evidence that by virtue of designating more parts or preferably all of Hezbollah, Australia would suddenly be at a loss diplomatically. That has not been the case for other countries that have taken those steps.
Thank you, Dr Levitt. We've just heard from Dr Matthew Levitt, who gave very helpful evidence about his expertise. I'm interested in your view about whether any harm is occasioned to Australia by only listing the external security organisation and not extending the listing to at least the military wing, if not the whole organisation of Hizballah. Any witness that feels they have a contribution to make.
Well, I'm happy to have a go at that, Mr Chairman. I'm thinking of the situation of someone like Hossam Yaqub, who was caught in Cyprus and said that he was engaged in surveillance activities of Jewish organisations and Jewish communities around the world. And he said that this is something that Hizballah does around the world. Now, I'm just taking a hypothetical situation, but it may not be that hypothetical, where an operative of Hezbollah in Australia conducts surveillance activities in relation to Jewish institutions and Jewish individuals, and is caught doing that and sends the information back to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And a prosecutor is then faced with having to prosecute that person and having to prove to the criminal standard that the information was being collected for the ESO and not for, say, the political arm of Hezbollah. It seems to me to just impose an additional burden on a prosecutor that wouldn't otherwise be necessary, and hamstring the operation of law enforcement in that regard. So that's just one situation that comes to mind. There may be others.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Wertheim. And indeed, you're right, it is not only a hypothetical. We have one real case that I'm aware of in Australia. Are any of the witnesses familiar with Mr Ali Haidar and his case? I'll just for the benefit of those watching who may not be, this is a person who was charged with violent offending, and New South Wales Police sought a supervision order over him because among his, in addition to his violent offending, he had a number of social media posts, tattoos and other paraphernalia associated with Hezbollah and also the Amal party. That application was not successful, according to Justice Davies, because he said that the Commonwealth had not listed the whole organisation of Hezbollah as a terrorist entity, only the ESO, and it wasn't possible for the court to determine whether this person's support was merely for the political entity of Hezbollah rather than the terrorist organisation. So that's a real example. Do any witnesses have a comment on that case?
Well, not other than beyond the situation that I outlined here before. It just imposes an unnecessary burden on a prosecutor and makes it all the more difficult to carry out what should be the intent of the legislation, which is to assist law enforcement in a situation like that, not impose a further obstacle.
Thank you.
The only thing I'd add to that as well, if I could, Chair, is that I'm aware that the Minister for Home Affairs was involved in that case to some degree and made some media comment on it, and in fact requested additional information on it. So there was clearly some government awareness of that situation. Unfortunately, I don't think there was a public response from the Minister after he sought that advice, but it was heartening, I suppose, to know that that was being taken seriously by government.
Thank you. Okay, I'll offer the call to a Labor colleague. Is there a Labor colleague who'd like to ask questions to these witnesses?
Senator Patterson, if I
sorry,
may,
Dr Khalil, please.
I just wanted to add to a further answer to your question about whether or not there's any harm to Australia and only listing the ESO. I think the harm is in the negative, in that I believe that Australia's interests would be better served by describing the entire organisation, and so therefore by not describing it, we are minimising the benefit to our national interests, and this includes in regards to tackling Hezbollah's international drug trafficking, its money laundering, obviously better coordination, better anti-terrorism coordination with our allies, and frankly, there's a growing trend of countries recognising that the entire organisation is a terrorist organisation, and I think it's not in Australia's interest to be left behind in that.
Thank you. All right, we'll go